No daughter of mine will marry a man like you. The words hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud. Robert Hastings, a man who built his fortune from the ground up, sat at the head of the long mahogany dinner table, his expression sharp and cold. Across from him sat Jake, the young man his daughter, Lily, had brought home to meet him. Robert had expected someone more. Someone polished. Someone with power, wealth, and a name that carried weight. Instead, the man before him wore a plain button-up shirt, calloused hands resting calmly on the table. A mechanic. That's what Lily had called him. Lily's face flushed with embarrassment. "Dad, please. Can we just have dinner?" Robert barely acknowledged her, keeping his gaze locked onto Jake. "Tell me, young man. What exactly do you plan to offer my daughter? Love? Passion? That won't put food on the table." Jake met Robert's glare without flinching. "I plan to give her everything she deserves." Robert scoffed. "Really? Everything?" He leaned back, fingers tapping the rim of his wine glass. "Fine. Let's test that. Since you're such a provider, you can pay for this meal." Lily gasped. "Dad, stop this. Why should I?" Robert's lips curled into a smirk. "If he's going to take care of you, he should be able to handle one little dinner bill." The challenge was cruel. Robert knew that. The restaurant they were in was one of the most exclusive in the city, one that even wealthy men hesitated to splurge on. The bill would be in the thousands. He expected Jake to panic, to fumble for an excuse. He was waiting for it. But Jake didn't blink. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. The room grew silent as he opened it. Robert leaned in, expecting hesitation, a sign of struggle. But instead, Jake simply pulled out a small business card and placed it on the table. "Call this number," Jake said calmly. Robert frowned, snatching up the card. It had nothing but a name and a number. "What is this?" Robert asked, suspicious. Jake gave him a small, knowing smile. "Just call it." The confidence in Jake's voice sent an uneasy shiver down Robert's spine. Something wasn't right. This wasn't the reaction he had anticipated. This boy, this mechanic, was far too calm. Lily, watching the exchange closely, looked between them, confused. "Jake, what's going on?" Jake's eyes never left Robert's. "Let's just say, I think your father is about to learn something he didn't expect." Robert's grip on the card tightened. His gut told him that calling the number would lead to something he wasn't prepared for. But now, there was no turning back. He had set the test. And now, he had no choice but to see it through. Robert narrowed his eyes at the card in his hand. It was simple, too simple. A name and a phone number. No title, no company name. Just Jake Thompson and a number beneath it. Lily leaned forward, confusion written across her face. "Jake, what is this?" Jake remained calm, his fingers interlocked as he sat back in his chair. "It's just a phone number, Mr. Hastings. If you want me to pay for dinner, I suggest you call it." Robert scoffed. He didn't like being played. He had built his empire by recognizing power moves, and right now, this felt like one. The only question was it real? He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the keypad. For a moment, he considered ignoring the whole thing, but something about Jake's unwavering confidence irritated him. "Fine. Let's see what game you're playing." With a skeptical grunt, Robert dialed the number and put the phone to his ear. The line rang once. Twice. Then. "Hastings Corporation Executive Office, how may I direct your call?" Robert blinked, his body going rigid. The voice was professional, polished. He knew it well. This was his own company's headquarters. His grip on the phone tightened. "This is Robert Hastings. Who am I speaking with?" The receptionist's voice instantly became more formal. "Mr. Hastings. My apologies, sir. You're calling from an unrecognized number. How can I assist you?" Robert hesitated. His eyes flickered toward Jake, who sat there, completely at ease. He cleared his throat. "I need information on a Jake Thompson." A brief pause. Then, the receptionist's voice lowered slightly, carrying an unmistakable note of respect. "Ah, of course, sir. Mr. Thompson is one of our most valued partners. Would you like me to connect you to his direct line?" Robert's stomach dropped. His mind scrambled for an explanation, but none made sense. Partner? Valued partner? He shot a glance at Jake, who remained still, watching him with an expression of quiet amusement. Robert turned away slightly and pressed the phone closer to his ear. "What exactly do you mean by valued partner?" "Mr. Thompson is a key business associate in our auto tech sector," the receptionist explained. "His company, JT Innovations, is one of our leading suppliers. The board speaks very highly of him." Robert's breath caught in his throat. He knew that name. JT Innovations. It was a powerhouse in the automotive technology industry, famous for designing next-generation engine systems. Hastings Corp had been working with them for nearly a year. Robert's own company had been negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts with this man sitting across from him. His daughter's boyfriend. He slowly lowered the phone, his thoughts spinning. The waiter arrived at that moment, placing the bill delicately in front of them. The total was obscene, as Robert had expected. But now, the situation had shifted entirely. Jake reached over, tapped the bill once, and then looked at Robert. "Still want me to pay?" Robert clenched his jaw. He had miscalculated, badly. He had tried to humiliate Jake, assuming he was just some broke grease monkey chasing after his daughter. Instead, he had walked straight into his own trap. Lily, still completely unaware of the storm brewing in her father's mind, frowned. "Dad? What's wrong?" Robert forced himself to straighten, adjusting his cuffs. He had two choices: acknowledge his mistake or double down. His pride burned at the idea of admitting he had misjudged Jake. So, he chose the latter. He let out a short, humorless chuckle. "So, you own a company. Impressive. But let me guess, you inherited it, didn't you?" Jake's easy smile didn't falter. "No. I built it from scratch." Robert's eyes narrowed. "Prove it." Jake leaned forward, folding his hands. "Gladly. But first, let me ask you something, Mr. Hastings." His voice remained steady, unshaken. "When you built your company, what was more important, your money or your work ethic?" Robert's lips pressed into a thin line. "Work ethic." Jake nodded. "Good. Then let's put that to the test." Lily looked between them, growing more anxious. "What do you mean?" Jake didn't look away from Robert. "Since money isn't the measure of a man, let's settle this another way." He tilted his head slightly. "You built your empire on business deals and smart investments, right? And I built mine on hard work and strategy." Robert's jaw clenched. "Get to the point." Jake smirked. "You and me. One challenge. Let's see who can turn a small amount of money into the biggest profit within 24 hours. Lily's mouth fell open. "Are you serious?" Jake nodded. "If I win, you stop judging me based on assumptions." Robert exhaled through his nose, his pride refusing to let him back down. "And if I win?" Jake smiled. "Then I'll walk away from Lily, no questions asked." Lily gasped. "Jake! No!" Robert barely heard her. His mind was already racing. He knew how to play this game. It was a business challenge, his territory. No way could Jake beat him. A slow, confident smile spread across Robert's face. "You're on." Jake extended his hand. "Deal?" Robert shook it firmly, squeezing harder than necessary. "Deal." Jake met his grip without hesitation, his confidence unshaken. But as the handshake ended, Robert couldn't shake the unease settling in his chest. Something told him, he might have just made a huge mistake. Robert Hastings prided himself on always being in control. Every deal he'd ever made, every contract he'd ever signed, it had all been done on his terms. Yet, here he was, gripping the edges of the restaurant table, watching a young man, a mechanic, of all things, sit across from him with a look of complete confidence. Jake had agreed to the challenge without hesitation. A business challenge. Robert's arena. And yet, something about Jake's calm demeanor made him uneasy. Lily, still stunned by the bet, grabbed Jake's arm. "You can't be serious. You're really going to put our relationship on the line over this?" Jake turned to her, his expression soft. "Lily, I'm not walking away from you. I just want your father to see me for who I really am." Robert scoffed. Who he really was? He was a mechanic, nothing more. Even if he owned a company, it didn't mean he built it. That kind of success didn't come from men with grease-stained hands. Still, something about the phone call earlier wouldn't leave his mind. Jake wasn't some nobody. He was a partner in Hastings Corporation. How had that happened? Robert's fingers hovered over his phone again. He needed more answers. With a quick glance at Jake, he stepped away from the table and walked toward the restaurant's entrance, dialing a number he never thought he'd have to call. After 2 rings, a voice picked up. "Mr. Hastings. I assume this is about Jake?" Robert stiffened. "You know him?" The voice on the other end chuckled. "Know him? Sir, Jake Thompson is one of the most brilliant business minds I've ever met. You've been negotiating contracts with him for months." Robert swallowed hard. "Tell me the truth. Did he inherit his company?" There was a pause. "No, sir. He built it from nothing. Started in a tiny garage with a few old tools. The man is a genius, an engineer, an investor, and a strategist all in one." Robert felt his breath hitch. A garage. A memory from decades ago surfaced. He had started his own empire in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment, hustling day and night, taking risks no one else would. And now, this boy, he had done the same thing? Still, Robert couldn't accept it. "And you're telling me he's successful?" A short laugh came from the other end of the line. "Sir, JT Innovations is projected to outgrow Hastings Corporation within the next 5 years. If anything, you should be trying to get on his good side." Robert's throat went dry. Outgrow Hastings Corp? This wasn't just some company Jake ran. This was the future. Suddenly, the challenge no longer felt like a surefire win. It felt like a dangerous game. His grip tightened around the phone. "Thank you." He hung up before the voice on the other end could respond. For the first time in years, Robert felt something rare creeping into his chest, doubt. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked back to the table. His expression was unreadable, but inside, his mind was racing. Jake simply watched him, waiting. "Well?" Lily asked. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Robert slid his phone into his pocket. His pride wouldn't let him admit the truth, not yet. Instead, he smirked. "Let's see what you've got, Jake." Jake nodded once, as if he had already expected that answer. "Tomorrow, then." They shook hands again, but this time, Robert wasn't so sure of himself. The next morning, Robert Hastings sat in his home office, staring at his laptop screen. He had spent the entire night researching JT Innovations, digging into Jake Thompson's history. What he found had shaken him. Jake hadn't just built a company, he had revolutionized an industry. Starting in a small garage with borrowed tools, he had developed a groundbreaking engine system that major automakers now competed to license. His company had gone from a single workshop to a multi-million-dollar enterprise in less than a decade. And somehow, he had remained entirely under the radar. No flashy media appearances, no bragging. Robert clenched his jaw. He had misjudged him. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. Lily stood there, arms crossed. "Dad, Jake's here." Robert stood, adjusting his cuffs. He wouldn't let this young man see the doubt in his eyes. As he stepped into the living room, Jake was already waiting. He wasn't nervous. Of course, he wasn't. "Ready to begin?" Jake asked casually. Robert smirked. "We'll see if you can handle it." They had agreed on the terms, each of them would start with $1,000. In 24 hours, whoever made the highest profit, honestly, would win. Robert had a plan. He had decades of experience in the stock market. With the right insider connections, he could turn $1,000 into $10,000 by nightfall. Jake, however, had other plans. "I'll see you both tomorrow," Jake said, kissing Lily on the cheek. "Where are you going?" Robert asked, suspicious. Jake grinned. "Back to work." And with that, he walked out the door. Robert frowned. Work? Did this man seriously think he could win by working? He shook his head and pulled out his phone. Time to play his game, his way. That night, Robert's strategy. Robert sat in his office, his monitors glowing with stock charts. He had made a series of calculated trades, leveraging his network and doubling his money by midnight. $1,000 had turned into $2,500 in less than 12 hours. He leaned back, satisfied. Jake had no chance. The business world was ruthless, and hard work alone wouldn't win. But then a thought crept into his mind: what was Jake doing? Curiosity gnawed at him. With a quick call, he reached out to a private investigator he occasionally hired for corporate matters. "I need you to find out what Jake Thompson has been doing for the past 12 hours. A short pause. Then. "You're not gonna believe this, sir." Jake's strategy, the power of hard work. Jake had spent the entire day in a mechanic's shop. Not running it. Working. With nothing but his hands, skill, and experience, he had spent 12 hours repairing engines, modifying high-performance vehicles, and taking custom requests from elite clients. And it had paid off. By the time the shop closed, Jake had earned over $5,000 in cash and deposits, all from honest, skilled labor. He didn't need stocks. He didn't need insider deals. He simply worked, and outperformed a billionaire at his own game. The next day, the final reveal. Robert sat in the living room, waiting. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't. Jake walked in, his expression as calm as ever. "Well?" Robert asked. "What did you make?" Jake reached into his pocket and placed a thick stack of cash on the table. $5,200. All earned by hand. Robert's stomach twisted. He had lost. Lily gasped. "Jake, how did you?" "Work," Jake said simply. "Honest, hard work." Robert swallowed. He had spent his entire life believing money made the man. But today, he had been proven wrong. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. Robert Hastings sat in silence, his fingers steepled under his chin. Across from him, Jake sat with calm confidence, his stack of $5,200 in cash resting neatly on the table. Robert's own number, $2, 500, suddenly felt pathetic in comparison. Lily sat between them, watching her father's reaction carefully. She knew him well enough to understand he wouldn't take this loss lightly. After a long pause, Robert finally leaned back in his chair. "So, you worked in a shop all day?" Jake nodded. 12 hours straight. Robert exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the polished wood of the table. "Impressive." His voice was measured, but Lily knew that tone. He was scheming. She narrowed her eyes. "Dad." Robert ignored her. His pride had been wounded, but he wasn't about to let Jake walk away thinking he had won. "You proved you can make money with hard work," Robert admitted. "But let me ask you this," he leaned forward, his sharp gaze locking onto Jake's. "How scalable is that?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Robert smirked, regaining some of his usual confidence. "Sure, you made $5,200 in one day. But what happens when you can't work? What if you get sick? Injured? What if time catches up to you?" He gestured at the money. "You made this with your hands." "I made mine with a single call." Lily groaned. "Dad." Robert held up a hand to silence her. His eyes never left Jake's. "I built my empire by working smarter, not harder. You won this round, but in the long run, my methods will always win." Jake listened patiently, nodding along. "Fair point." Robert raised an eyebrow. "That's all you have to say?" Jake smiled. "I agree with you. Long term, money should work for you, not the other way around." Robert opened his mouth to respond, but Jake wasn't finished. "But there's something you don't understand," Jake continued. "I didn't just fix cars yesterday. I built relationships. The clients I worked with, they weren't just random people, they were collectors, business owners, investors." Robert frowned. "What are you saying?" Jake leaned forward. "I made $5,200 yesterday. But those clients? They've already booked future work with my company worth over $200,000. My reputation alone made me more money than any stock trade ever could." Robert's mouth went dry. Jake smiled. "And here's the best part, I didn't have to cheat the system to do it." Lily gasped. "Dad, you cheated?" Robert stiffened. His face hardened. "I didn't cheat. I used my resources. That's what a businessman does." Jake shook his head. "No. That's what a man afraid of real work does." Silence. The words hit Robert harder than he expected. Lily watched as her father's face darkened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a man he had dismissed as unworthy just 24 hours ago. Robert exhaled sharply. "All right, kid. You made your point." He glanced at the money on the table. "You won the challenge." Lily beamed. "So you finally accept Jake?" Robert's jaw tightened. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could answer. Robert Hastings sat back in his chair, arms crossed, staring at Jake. He had just admitted defeat in their challenge, a rare thing for a man of his stature. Yet, something inside him still burned. Jake had proven himself hard-working, capable, and smart. But Robert wasn't ready to back down completely. He cleared his throat. "You made more money than me in a day." "Fine. But a real businessman doesn't just win once. He builds something that lasts." Jake raised an eyebrow, amused. "Are you saying you want another challenge?" Robert smirked. "One more. A real one this time." Lily groaned. "Dad, stop. You already lost. Why can't you just admit?" Robert held up a hand. "This isn't about pride, Lily. It's about proof. If Jake wants to marry into this family, I need to know he's not just lucky, I need to know he can hold his own in the long run. Jake chuckled. I don't need to prove anything to you, Mr. Hastings. Robert smirked. Then why did you take the first challenge? Silence. Lily looked at Jake, worried. Jake, you don't have to do this. Jake thought for a moment, then slowly nodded. All right. What's the challenge? Robert leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. This was his game now. You and I will each take $10,000. We have 1 week to turn it into the most profitable business venture possible. No outside investments, no using existing contacts, no corporate influence. Just pure business instinct. Lily sighed. Dad, you're being ridiculous. But Jake. Jake was smiling. Deal, he said, shaking Robert's hand. And just like that, the final challenge began. Jake's strategy, back to the basics. The next morning, Jake did something unexpected. He didn't check the stock market. He didn't call business partners. Instead, he drove down to a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of town. There, he met with a struggling auto shop, a family-owned business on the verge of shutting down. Their equipment was outdated, their marketing non-existent. Jake sat down with the owner, a grizzled man named Hank, and made an offer. I'll invest $10,000 into your shop, Jake said. In exchange, I take 50% of the profits for the next 6 months. Hank laughed. Kid, we barely make enough to keep the lights on. Jake smiled. Give me a week. And just like that, Jake rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He used his knowledge of high-performance vehicles to bring in new clients, ones who were willing to pay premium prices. He rebranded the shop, setting up social media and online ads that tripled customer traffic. He brought in a single new tool, a high-tech diagnostic scanner that let them work on luxury cars. By the end of the week, the shop wasn't just making money, it was thriving. Jake's $10,000 investment turned into a projected profit of over $50,000 in 6 months. And Robert? Robert's strategy, playing the market. Robert Hastings wasn't about to get his hands dirty. He used his decades of knowledge to invest his $10,000 in fast-moving stocks, crypto, and short-term trades. And for the first few days, it worked. He tripled his money in 48 hours. By the 5th day, he was sitting at $35,000. But then, the market crashed. One bad call. One tiny miscalculation. And Robert lost everything. His $35,000 shrank to $2,000 overnight. He had never lost a business challenge before. But this time, he had gambled. And Jake hadn't. The final showdown. At the end of the week, Robert sat at the same dinner table, but this time, he wasn't confident. Jake arrived with a folder in his hand. He placed it in front of Robert and calmly said, "That's the projected revenue for the auto shop I invested in." Robert opened it. His eyes scanned the numbers. Projected growth, $50,000 in 6 months. Jake had built something. Robert had played the system and lost. The older man exhaled sharply, staring at the numbers. "Lily," he finally said, voice low. "Go upstairs for a moment." She frowned. "Why?" "Please." She hesitated, then left the room. The silence stretched between the two men. Then, Robert spoke. "I underestimated you." Jake didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply nodded. "I know." Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. "You earned this." "I don't say that often." Jake folded his arms. "So, do I have your blessing?" Robert stared at him for a long moment. Then, he slowly extended his hand. Jake shook it. And just like that, Robert Hastings, a man who never admitted defeat, had finally accepted his future son-in-law. Robert Hastings had spent his entire life winning. He didn't lose, not in business, not in life. Yet here he was, handing over his daughter's future to the one man he had tried to break. The handshake with Jake lingered for a second longer than necessary. It wasn't just an acknowledgement, it was a surrender. Robert pulled his hand back and cleared his throat. "I'm a man of my word. You won the challenge." Jake simply nodded. No gloating, no arrogance. Just quiet confidence. That made it worse. Robert wasn't sure why, but something about Jake's attitude bothered him more than losing. He glanced at the folder again, the $50,000 projected revenue Jake had secured in a week. Meanwhile, Robert's failed stock trade sat in the back of his mind like a stone. "Tell me something," Robert said, crossing his arms. "If you're so smart, why did you choose to work as a mechanic in the first place?" Jake leaned back, thoughtful. "Because I love it." Robert frowned. "That's it?" Jake shrugged. "That's it." Robert scoffed. "You could be running a billion-dollar company." Jake smiled. "Who says I'm not?" Robert's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Jake exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "You assumed I was just some small-time mechanic. But I never told you I was." Robert stiffened. "Go on." Jake tilted his head. "Did you ever bother to look into who actually owns JT Innovations?" Robert frowned. "It's a private company. There's no official public documentation." Jake smiled. "Exactly." Robert's breath hitched. "The only people who keep a company that private are." Jake leaned forward slightly. "Hastings Corp has been negotiating deals with my company for almost a year. You never questioned who you were dealing with." Robert's pulse quickened. "What are you saying?" Jake folded his hands. "I own JT Innovations outright. No board. No investors. Just me." Silence. Robert froze. Lily, who had quietly returned, gasped. "Jake, you never told me that." Jake gave her a small smile. "It never mattered to me." Robert's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a young man trying to prove himself. Jake wasn't just rich. He was more powerful than Robert had ever imagined. And the worst part? He had never bragged about it. Robert clenched his jaw. "Why, didn't you tell me?" Jake exhaled. "Because I wanted you to see me for who I was, not for my money." Robert swallowed hard. He had spent days trying to humiliate Jake, to prove he wasn't worthy. And all along, Jake had already won. Lily stepped forward, shaking her head in disbelief. "Dad, you were testing Jake this whole time, but he never needed to prove himself to you. You needed to prove yourself to him." Robert's heart pounded. He had spent years measuring men by their wealth, by their power. And now? A man who had everything had just beaten him by showing he needed nothing. For the first time in his entire life, Robert Hastings felt something unfamiliar. Humility. Robert Hastings had spent his entire life believing he was the smartest man in the room. But tonight, sitting across from Jake, he realized he had been wrong. His entire world had been built on status, wealth, and control. He had assumed Jake was nothing more than a blue-collar worker trying to climb above his station. He had underestimated him. Now, the truth was staring him in the face. Jake had played the game better than he ever could. Lily's words rang in his ears. "You were testing Jake this whole time, but he never needed to prove himself to you. You needed to prove yourself to him." Robert inhaled deeply, forcing himself to accept the weight of those words. Across the table, Jake sat with quiet confidence, not gloating, not waiting for an apology, just watching. That somehow made it worse. After a long silence, Robert finally spoke. His voice was lower now, less sharp. So, you own everything? Jake nodded. I built it myself. Robert exhaled, shaking his head. And you never once thought to mention it? Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Would it have mattered? If I had told you the truth from the start, would you have respected me, or would you have just assumed I was some trust fund kid who got lucky? Robert had no response. Because Jake was right. Robert had made up his mind the moment he saw Jake's worn hands, his simple clothes. He had judged him before he had even spoken a word. Lily folded her arms, shaking her head in disappointment. Dad, do you even realize what you've done? Robert met her gaze, seeing the frustration in her eyes. She continued, voice tight. You wanted to test Jake, but all you did was prove how shallow you can be. He didn't need to win your approval, but you were so blinded by your own pride that you couldn't see that. The word stung. Robert ran a hand down his face. How had he gotten it so wrong? Then, after a long pause, he did something he had never done before. He swallowed his pride. I was wrong about you, Robert admitted. His voice was quieter now, more measured. I assumed I knew everything just by looking at you. I thought I understood what made a man successful. But I was wrong. Lily's eyes widened slightly, as if she had never expected to hear those words from him. Jake, to his credit, didn't rub it in. He simply nodded. I respect that. Robert let out a humorless chuckle. I don't lose often. Jake smirked. That makes two of us. For the first time that night, Robert saw something in Jake he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just confidence. It wasn't just intelligence. It was discipline. Jake had played this entire situation like a chess match, never reacting emotionally, never letting pride cloud his judgment. He had let Robert dig his own grave, never once lowering himself to his level. And in the end, he had come out on top. Robert slowly stood up and extended his hand. This time, it wasn't a power move. It was an acknowledgement. Jake took it. And just like that, the war between them was over. Lily watched in awe, blinking back tears. She had never thought she would see this moment. Robert turned to her and exhaled. I just wanted to make sure you were with the right man. Lily shook her head, smiling softly. Dad. I've always known. Robert chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah. I guess you did. For the first time that night, he felt relief. He wasn't just gaining a son-in-law. He was gaining a man he could finally respect. The next morning, Robert Hastings sat in his home office, staring out the window. The city skyline stretched before him, a view he had always taken pride in. It was his empire, a reflection of his success. But last night had changed something in him. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at the skyline as a man who had conquered the business world. He was looking at it as a man who had been humbled. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he said. The door opened, and Jake stepped inside. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wasn't here for a business meeting. He was just himself, hands in his pockets, as casual and confident as ever. Mind if I sit? Jake asked. Robert gestured to the chair across from his desk. Go ahead. There was a pause before Jake spoke. You all right? Robert chuckled, shaking his head. You just handed me the biggest loss of my career. What do you think? Jake smirked. I think you'll survive. Robert exhaled. Yeah. I suppose I will. Silence stretched between them for a moment before Robert finally spoke again. You know. I spent my whole life believing that wealth and status made the man. That money was the measure of success. Jake leaned back. And now? Robert sighed. Now I see that character matters more. The ability to build something from nothing. The ability to stay grounded no matter how high you climb. He looked at Jake. That's what I failed to see in you at first. Jake nodded, not needing to say anything. Robert tapped his fingers against the desk, then smirked. You remind me of myself when I was younger. Jake raised an eyebrow. Really? Robert chuckled. Yeah. Except for one thing. What's that? You're better than I was. Jake's expression flickered, surprised by the honesty in Robert's words. Robert leaned forward. I built my empire with ambition, strategy, and power. But you? You built yours with integrity. That's the difference between us. Jake studied him for a moment, then nodded. I appreciate that. Robert exhaled, standing up. I've spent too much time trying to test you, Jake. But the truth is, I see it now. I see the kind of man you are. And if Lily sees it too, then I'd be a fool to stand in the way. Jake stood as well, and for the first time, Robert didn't see him as an opponent. He saw him as a future son. Robert extended his hand one more time. Not as a businessman. Not as a test. But as a father. Jake took it, shaking it firmly. I promise I'll take care of her, Jake said. Robert smirked. I know you will. At that moment, Lily appeared in the doorway. Is this really happening? She asked, eyes wide. Robert glanced at Jake, then back at his daughter. He sighed. Yeah. It is. Lily's face lit up, and she rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her father. Thank you, Dad. Robert hesitated, then hugged her back. I just want what's best for you, sweetheart. She pulled away, smiling. And now you know Jake is what's best for me. Robert chuckled. Yeah. I guess I do. Jake slipped an arm around Lily's waist. You were right about one thing, Mr. Hastings. Robert raised an eyebrow. Oh? Jake grinned. In the long run, smart business always wins. Robert laughed. For the first time in years, it wasn't the laugh of a man who had won. It was the laugh of a man who had learned. And for the first time in his life, that felt like a victory.